Hi, my name is Cedric Tai, and this is a Prezi presentation slash Pecha Kucha performance as part of my solo show, Concept, Structure, Torture, Survival title, which is taking place in New City Space. We're talking about one of the first research topics I thought about studying in grad school, happiness. This elusive quality of life is constantly being defined, and most people tend to have their own personal take on what it is. I thought it'd be interesting to see what would happen if I tried to make an art piece about the journey to make talking about happiness meaningful and more commonplace. So I'm wondering, does representing happiness kill the joy, so to speak, or does it act like a placebo effect? Or if you use it as a catalyst to fake that you're happy, that you might actually become more so. First off, I'd like to thank those people who have encouraged me to do something different than what I'm used to, which is primarily making abstract paintings. Rachel Yesbeck is my partner and a published anthropologist and also now making art. Ross Byers is a friend that I've made since coming to Glasgow, and our relationship is featured in some of the artwork in the show. And lastly, Chun and Ju, who own the flat that this show is taking place in. We're currently in their living room, and they've really sacrificed a lot of their own space to put on some interesting shows. So, some of you may have seen this diagram. It's a lithograph and silkscreen print that was the flyer for the show, and it depicts 4 different definitions of happiness that is represented to show that there's areas that overlap and discrepancies of how we define happiness. I think I need to point out also that the black text below isn't part of the art piece. It's just different words for what I'm trying to talk about. So part of the reason I think there's so much discrepancy between the different ways we describe meaningfulness is because sometimes it's described as an emotion, sometimes a lifestyle, and sometimes it's just considered a concept that describes the opposite of feeling shitty. But I'd say that although we differ on how we talk about happiness, we're all in fact searching for a way to communicate what we value and trying to make this concept have value with other people. If you can control the conditions in which happiness can occur, I would argue that you're controlling reality and how you inhabit reality. So actually, let's take a step back and look at happiness as part of a process of needs. This is a diagram by an educator named Abraham Maslow, who believed that if you have the capacity to be a better human being, then you must strive for that. His diagram, you could say, rationalizes all the kinds of actions that we would normally label as bad behavior, such as stealing. But what if someone is stealing food in order to eat? We stop short of blaming this person when we think about things in perspective. And happiness has everything to do with perspective. So I would go farther and say that making art belongs in this bottom area of needs, and our teachers need to be in the area of self-actualization, but I'll save that for another presentation. I wanted to take a little bit to describe something about the process of making these top 2 circles. They're made by printing off of a lithograph stone that I've prepared with something called touche that leaves that organic texture around the word flow, and I used oily crayon to make marks around the word zen. While making these works, I actually came up with an interesting creative solution to make the oily crayon go around the word zen, and that's because I silkscreened the words as well as the circles in gum arabic. So, alright, this all may sound very alien to what I'm talking about, but I'll show you a print that I made in tandem with this. So this is a print that has a lot of different marks and mark making techniques all over it. Basically, a lithograph stone, when it's blank, can be drawn on with different oily substances. These oily substances are etched with an acid so they can hold ink, and the rest of the stone, when wet, doesn't allow the ink to stick. So when you put a piece of paper on top of the stone and you use a big press, it transfers that ink to the paper. But then you have to re-ink it every time you want to make a print. So in this image, the digital looking pixels are actually the areas that I silk screened to resist the oily marks, which is why it is white, the color of the paper. I went on that tangent because subversion and genuine exchange has a place in all of my work. This is an image of one of my abstract paintings that I mentioned earlier. It's a small piece I gifted to Kirsten Lloyd and her husband for letting me stay the night at their place in Edinburgh. I realized that as much fun as it is to make work with my own hands, it seems like once something's finished, I lose a lot of my initial excitement about it. But once I give something that I gained to someone else, whether that's an object or in the case of making these prints, or a new creative way of working, it seems like it gives the work renewed value. I feel like I have value. So that brings us back to this print. I also was using this print as a kind of thank you note for people that have helped me out so far with my arts practice at the Glasgow School of Art. I wasn't using it to barter or to act just as currency, but I was interested in making it more clear what I believe it means when someone accepts a work of art from me that is laden with cultural capital. They are accepting something that holds in it my values, and like my paintings, I enjoy the conversation that stems from talking about this print. And so I take these with me everywhere I go. This is a photo documentation of a beer a guy handed me on the train to Edinburgh. Once he heard my American accent, he chatted me up in the usual aggressively friendly Glaswegian way. He and his girlfriend really loved that they unexpectedly got something back, and even better, that it was a work of art that in some ways reflected the very things that we were chatting about. Okay, so I'll finally start describing what each circle is. This is the gist that I say to everyone who gets one of these. There's the circle that reads Zen. That's the kind of happiness that seems like more of an attitude than something that is a result of taking direct actions to be happy. You know those people who really seem content, where nothing phases them, cool as cucumber? Nothing is ever really that bad. So it's more about a state of being, not about a process. And then there's this concept called flow, coined by psychologist Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, who says that happiness is all about the process. His research on play concretely can show that we are most happy when we are taking on challenges that are not too hard and not too easy. So he debunks the idea of happiness as deriving from material sources or from wealth by explaining that we could technically be given everything we wanted and we still wouldn't be happy because it's effort that creates satisfaction. So his description of happiness deals with making positive goals and thinking about motivation. His research also describes that the more activities that put us into a state of flow, the better the chances of being happy. And we all differ in what that activity is from one person to another. These bottom two circles are ones that I made up to encompass something missing from the more politically correct ways of describing those things that make us feel good. In fact, I read recently an article from a mom saying that flow doesn't take into account the aspect of unhappiness as a part of meaningfulness from something like raising her child. So that doesn't necessarily bring her instant gratification, yet it's the most meaningful thing she could have ever imagined in her life. To read everything easier, we'll switch to this digital version. I just want to point out again that we rarely talk about happiness in relation to art, as if it's taboo, as if sincerity is something to always treat with suspicion. But I question, why do we consider artwork that is made without blood, sweat, and tears as not as good as art made under duress? What is art other than an attempt to make meaning? So this bottom circle, combining these words, acceptance, low expectations, and absurdity, it comes from a rather lighthearted way of approaching how many of us commit to a certain perspective that isn't as holistic as being Zen, and it doesn't involve changing a whole lot. Sometimes it's like a switch that gets hit in your brain, and even though nothing makes sense, you realize that it's not about doing the best you can, and it's all right. On this end is where that mom perspective comes in. If happiness is only in our heads privately, how do we really know it exists? None of the other ways of getting at happiness accounts for another person. Happiness is, in this way, in the same vein as flow. It's a process, but our ability to achieve it isn't solely in our hands. It's something we create with another person that makes it real. So this project, in retrospect, hasn't been a breakthrough by any means, and the work has been accepted with very mixed reactions. In one example, an older gentleman had offered me some crisps, and I instinctively handed him a print. He looked at it and asked me which church I belonged to. There have been a lot of references that I've been looking into as far as value, meaning, and exchanges. Marx bases some of his theories on the idea that we derive much of our happiness from our relationship with work. Pierre Bourdieu's theories of cultural capital, when applied to this work, reveals to me that perhaps I've been playing up the value of the artwork as art in order to get as much bang for my buck, a creation of currency based on my value system. And finally, the concept in Marcel Mauss's book, The Gift, would contend that any gift, although given with the appearance of having no strings attached, by definition actually does bring an unspoken debt with every favor. Lastly, I'll talk about the really enjoyable book by Dan Ariely called Predictably Irrational that explains that happiness has its mental limits before we become dissatisfied again, and this is due to the fact that we're constantly making comparisons. So perhaps the simplest explanation for a better life is focusing less on whether or not we're following the right path towards happiness, meaningfulness, pleasure, self-actualization. But if we know how our mind works, we can at best reduce the occasions that would make us aware in a way that we know makes us dissatisfied. And happiness in its most complex and diverse forms is everything else. Thank you.